This morning, we want to discuss the idea of running the Christian race. If you want to turn to Hebrews chapter 12, we're going to be looking there this morning and learning some things from what the Hebrew writer has to say. Now, races are something that can be fun or they can be grueling. I remember in school, I don't know if you had the field day where you had all the little activities and you got little ribbons. And it seemed like they wanted to give a ribbon to everybody. They went all the way down to like sixth or seventh or eighth place ribbons for those little activities. And you had the three-legged race and the sack race and all these sorts of different things. And you threw a frisbee or something, did all sorts of different activities that they had, and they gave prizes for. And those races were fun. Some other races, however, like a marathon, is a grueling ordeal of 26 miles of torture on your body, which I've never done, but I know it is because the first guy who ran one died at the end of it. I've never wanted to say, hey, that guy ran that marathon and died, so I think I want to do that too. That's not me. I didn't want to. I don't want that race. I'll skip that one. But some of it, track and field and junior high and high school, and that they can be some fun things. A race can. But the Christian race is one of those that's in some ways more like the marathon. It's not just a sprint that's over in a few short minutes or a few short seconds. It's something that lasts not even hours like a marathon does, 3 hours or so for the faster of the marathon runners. But the Christian race is a race that lasts for years, decades even, lasts your entire life from the time you become a Christian until you die. That's a long race. And so you need to be ready for it. And you need encouragement along the way. Because even as how many runners start a marathon but never finish? Because somewhere along the way it was too hard. Most runners that start a 100-meter dash or 100-yard dash or whatever it is now, used to be a 100-yard dash, then they made it 100 meters, which made it a little longer. But still, a 100-meter dash, well, that takes a few seconds, and most of the runners that start that one can finish it. It's over in 10 seconds or so. And most people can run that far, that long, or they wouldn't be on the track in the first place. The only time somebody doesn't finish one of those is if they trip and fall and hurt themselves in some way. But the longer race, they need some encouragement along the way. If you've ever seen someone running those marathons, along the way they have hydration stations set up. And as the runners are running along the course, they can stop and they can get some Gatorade or something to help them to make it on through the race. They even have set up along the way medical personnel in case somebody pushed too far or too hard, and maybe the heat or maybe dehydration or something has caused them to need medical attention. And they encourage the runners to be able to finish the race. And so it is with us in our Christian race. We need some encouragement along the way. In Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, the writer there says, therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. And can you imagine them? He's talking about those that are up there in heaven. He's just talked about in chapter 11 all of the faithful. By faith, Abraham. By faith, Moses. By faith, he goes through that whole list. And then he starts chapter 12 and saying, now these are all people that have lived the life, followed God, served God, and died faithful to him. And they're now this cloud of witnesses. They're in heaven watching us, so to speak. They're watching the rest of us as we're running our race. Now, we can't hear their shouts of encouragement like you can in a regular physical race. But knowing that they're there, knowing that they finished the race, can give us some encouragement to know that we too can finish the race. We can remain faithful till death. But he says because of that, since we're surrounded by this group of people who's witnessing us running this race, let us lay aside every weight. That's the first thing. Take off your weights. You know, a lot of times runners in training have weights on, but they don't keep them on for the race. When it's time for the race, you take the weights off. And he says, the sin which so easily ensnares us or besets us, the things that would trip us up, those sins, get rid of those. And let us run with endurance the race that's set before us. We need to endure these things. It's so important to make it and not give up. You know, one of the biggest mistakes when you talk about a marathon that people make, uh, well, if you ask me, one of the biggest mistakes is entering a marathon. But the biggest mistakes that marathon runners claim that people make is starting out too fast. They run it like it's going to be a short race, and they run out, and then by the time they've gone a mile or two, they've given all they've got, and they can't make it all the way. They're already out of gas. And so we've got to run with endurance. We've got to know it's a long race. Don't run out there like it's a sprint. You'll run out of gas. It's a long, lifelong endurance that's needed. And then he says in verse 2, looking unto Jesus. We've got to keep our eyes on that finish line. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Now, he's not saying that the cross was a joy. He endured the cross. That was suffering. But he endured it because he knew there was a joy that was on the other side of it. And that's the way it is with a race. A race is hard. It's difficult, but you endure the pain of the race for that finish line. What's that joy that's on the other side? And that's what makes it worth it. He says he endured the cross. He despised the shame and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself. He wasn't someone that was liked by everyone. We might think that he was, but he wasn't. There were those that hated him so much that they killed him, in fact. The hostility from the sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. There are going to be some people who are going to look down on us for trying to live the Christian life. They're going to wonder why we don't run with the same crowd we used to, why we don't do the things we used to do. And they're going to think we're fools. They're going to think there's something wrong with us for acting that way. But we need to remember and consider what Jesus suffered. And let that be the thing that keeps us from being discouraged. He says, you have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. We may have some people make fun of us. We may have some people say some things derogatorily toward us for being Christians. But we haven't had to get to the point of shedding blood because of our Christian faith like many in the first century church had. Apparently the Hebrews that he was writing to had not yet either. They knew of some who had, though, no doubt. They had heard the stories about other places and other Christians who had suffered to the point of shedding blood or even to the point of death, but they had not. So as we think about this, we're in a Christian race. We're in the race for Christ. We're in the race for heaven. We're in a race for life that is abundant and eternal. We're in a race to live with God forever. We're in a race for perfection, a perfect life in a world without suffering, without corruption, without evil, without death. We're in that kind of a race. And the great thing about this race, that is a race for righteousness and justice and godliness, a race to really get to know God. The thing about all of these human races that we have, all of these, whether it's the 100-meter dash or the marathon, whether it's a triathlon where they swim, bike, and run. I was talking to a young man just a couple days ago that's going to be competing in a triathlon. I'd drown, I'm sure. I can't swim that good. But all of those races, there's a winner and there are losers. Even whether it's the Olympics or whether it's collegiate level or whatever category it is, whatever age range there is, there's a first place. And maybe there's a second and third. But then down the list are the also rans. And they don't get a prize, they don't win anything. They completed the race just like all the others, but they don't get an award for that. The wonderful thing about the Christian race is you don't have to come in first place. You don't have to run it the fastest. You don't have to end it the quickest. Everyone who finishes the race gets the prize. Everyone that finishes. Now, sometimes in a race, when so many have finished and somebody knows that they're not going to win or even place, they just quit. They just give up. But with the Christian race, there's never a reason to quit. Because if you endure to the end, you'll receive the crown of life. You don't have to be the best, the fastest, the strongest, the number one. You just have to persevere and make it through. Isn't that good to know? I was never the fastest. I wasn't always this fat. I used to be skinny. Believe it or not, when I was in track, I actually ran track. I actually ran the 100 and the 220 and the relay. Yeah, it's hard to look at me now and believe that could happen, but it did back then. But I wasn't the fastest. Oh, I got some second or third place ribbons on some things, but I was never the champion. But as a Christian, I can be the champion because I can finish the race, even if I don't come in first. But we need to think about that. We all begin this race when we become a Christian. If you haven't become a Christian, you need to enter the race. You need to get started on this race because you can't get the prize if you're not in the race. You know, I could go and ride in a car the same course that the marathoners run, and I could get to the end of the race and go, okay, here I am, give me my gold medal. And they'd all look at me and laugh. They know better than that. They know I didn't run that race. I drove the course. That's not the same thing. If you're not a Christian, if you're not in the race, you may even be doing some of the same things that Christians do. You may be giving money to the church. You may be singing songs. You're sitting here listening to a sermon. But if you're not a child of God, if you're not a member of His body, if you haven't entered the race, it's not doing you any good. You need to get in the race. But we begin that race when we become Christians and we finish it at death. Now, unfortunately, some people will quit the race before they get to the end. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we've got to stay on the narrow course. We've got to follow the path that's laid out by Christ. We can't just pick shortcuts. You know, a lot of times a marathon or something takes a route that's not the most direct route from point A to point B. They go this way and that way and, and wind around, and you could just go up to there. You can't take shortcuts with Christ. There are no shortcuts. You've got to follow Him. You've got to stay on that narrow course. Matthew 7:13 through 14 says, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. And there are many who go in there. But narrow is the gate and difficult is the way that leads to life. And there are few who find it. Had a niece that ran cross-country races. Well, that's even tougher. Instead of a nice flat course, you're out there jumping over felled trees and running through brush and down paths and all that kind of stuff. Well, there was surely a quicker, shorter way to go. But if you go that way, that's cheating. You've got to stay on the course that's marked out. You have to go over those logs or under those branches. You've got to do those things in a cross country race. And so it is with Christ. He's laid out the course, and we've got to follow the course. We've got to compete according to the rules. We must. We can't just ignore things and do it our own way. 2 Timothy 2, 3 through 5, Paul says to Timothy, "You must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No one engaged in warfare entangles himself in the affairs of this life, so that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. And also, if anyone competes in athletics, he is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules." Many years ago, I don't remember the woman's name. You could look it up when you get home. There was a woman who decided that she was going to win. I think it was the Boston Marathon. She thought she's going to win that thing, but she hadn't trained like she should, and so she came up with a better plan. She started the race with everyone else, and then about a mile or so in, she got off the course and caught the trolley and took it to the other end, or maybe a cab. I don't remember how she got there, but she went down about, a mile or so from the other end. She waited until, the people were getting kind of close to that point and jumped back in and ran the rest of it. So she ran about 2 miles instead of 26. She splashed water on her so she looked like she'd been sweating and everything like everybody else. And of course she did run a couple of miles, so she was hot and tired a little bit. Well, of course she crosses the line and oh wow, and she, and they're going to give her the award. She's going to get the gold medal. She's won the race. She came in first. And then they started looking at it and they started realizing her time is like 30 minutes faster than any woman has ever run this marathon. Is she really that good? Because nobody'd ever heard of her. And so they started looking, and they found camera footage where she had gotten on the trolley or off the trolley and got back, and they disqualified her. Of course, she didn't get to win because she cheated. We know you cheat, you don't win. You don't get to keep the prize if you've cheated. We've got to compete according to the rules, and the same thing is true with the Christian life. There's no cheat codes. There's no shortcuts. We have to do it God's way. So the things we want to pay attention to then is what he says here. Lay aside every weight. Ankle weights, wrist weight, hand weights, anything that would slow us down. There's a reason people don't go running marathons in trench coats carrying backpacks. And I know some of the soldiers have to, they got to put their pack on and do all that gear and that's tough. That makes it that much harder. But when you're running a marathon, they're wearing a tank top and shorts and lightest weight running shoes they can get. They don't want any extra weight. In fact, in the first Olympics back in the day in Greece, the Grecian Olympics, they took off everything. They ran naked to get rid of anything that could weigh them down. That was the way they did it back then. We don't go quite that far, but you don't want a lot of extra weight when you're trying to carry it for 20 something miles. Well, we need to get rid of our weight as well. The things that would slow us down, that weight may be cares and riches and pleasures of this life. And it may be things that in and of themselves are not necessarily sinful, but they're just things that are hindrances to us. They're things that are slowing us down and keeping us from following Christ as we should. Luke chapter 8 and verse 14 talks about some seed that fell among the thorns and got choked down by the cares and riches and pleasures of life. They brought no fruit to maturity because of that. Our weight may be other people. It may even be people we love. It may even be family members. Luke chapter 14 and verse 26. Jesus says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. We've got to put Jesus first. We've got to have him be the love of our life, the thing that we're most dedicated to. And we can't allow anyone else, even people that we love, to hinder us from making it to heaven, from being with Christ. The weight may be a desire for riches or covetousness or something of that nature that gets us wanting other things that distract us. 1 Timothy 6:9-10. Those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful lusts which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. We've got to beware of those weights. Some things that, like I said, they're not sinful things necessarily, but our love for those things can draw us away from God. And anything that draws us away from God and hinders us is a weight that we need to get away from. And it is unfortunate sometimes that the people that we love might even be some of those things that are hindering us from making it to be with God. I think about Job's wife when I think about that. As much as he loved his wife, when the troubles came upon him, and I know we pick on her, she suffered the same losses he did, the same loss of wealth, the same loss of the children, all of those things. She still had her health, though. He lost even his health. But she was a hindrance to him. She said, well, Job, why don't you just curse God and die? Instead of encouraging him to be strong and to continue to love God and serve God, she turned against him. She tried to drag him down when he was already at his lowest point. And there are sometimes people in our lives who will try to drag us down and drag us away from God instead of helping to encourage us to get closer to him and follow him better. The second thing we talked about there in the verse is to lay aside the sin. There are some things that just hinder us that wouldn't necessarily be sinful for everyone, but there are some things that are just sinful. We need to put that sin to death. Ephesians 4:17-22 talks about that. He says you need to put off the things of your former conduct, the old man that's grown corrupt in verse 22. We need to put away the fleshly lusts that war against the soul, 1 Peter 2 and verse 11 tells us. We need to be sure that we don't let sin control us, to reign over us. Sin always wants to be the master. From the time that God warned Cain, sin's lying at the door and wants to have you. From that point on, sin has always wanted to weasel its way into people's lives and gain control. Now, I know we're personifying sin as though sin has a mind of its own, but it's not really that. It's just that when we get sin in our lives, we let that sin have power over us, and we've got to stop that. Don't let sin control you. Romans 6 and verse 12 says, do not let sin reign in your mortal body. Do not obey it in its lusts. Sin easily ensnares us. Proverbs 7 verses 22-23 talks about this poor fool who goes after this adulterous woman. And he doesn't even realize it until the arrow has struck his liver. It's like a bird hastening to the snare and not knowing that it's going to cost the bird its life. And he's the same way. He's chasing after this woman that's not his and not right for him to have, but he desires her and he's going to get caught in that snare. There are snares of the tongue, Proverbs 6:2, snares from the others that we associate with, Proverbs 22:24-25, snares where we just go too far. We transgress God's law in Proverbs 29 and verse 6. Snares of fear, Proverbs 29 and verse 25, where we fear man instead of fearing the Lord. There are snares of lust, Ecclesiastes 7:26. There are a lot of things that can snare us and cause us to be entangled and tripped up in sin so that we cannot finish the race. And we get pulled out of the race by those snares of sin. And then, of course, we talked about we need to finish the race. How sad it is to see someone who started the race and won't finish it. It's sad to see someone who starts the race and drops out quickly. But the saddest of all, I have seen those who started the race and ran it for years, 10, 30, 50 years into the Christian race. And then as they're closing in on the finish line, then they quit. Then they turn aside and go off into the world and don't finish that race. Those are the saddest to me indeed. A good start is important, but it doesn't guarantee the success. In Galatians 5:7, Paul says to the Galatian Christians, "You ran well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth?" They started the race and they were running well, and then they got hindered. They didn't finish. We need to train well. 1 Corinthians 9:27, Paul says, "I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest after I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified." We have to continue to keep ourselves in good condition for the race. Just like a runner eats the right foods and drinks fluids and water and those things that will help them in that race, we spiritually need to be feeding ourselves the right things. We need to be disciplining ourselves in the spiritual sense as well. Putting mind over matter, putting spiritual over physical, putting those things in the way that they should be so we're not disqualified from the race that we're running. We need to be diligent, Romans 12:11, fervent in serving the Lord. We need to persevere, 1 Corinthians 15:58. We need to be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, he tells us. Our labor in the Lord is not in vain. We're serving God. We're going to receive the reward for it if we continue, if we persevere. We need to be making a concentrated effort toward this. Philippians 3:13 and 14, Paul says, I haven't apprehended it yet. I forget those things that are behind. I reach toward those things ahead. I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward calling of God in Christ Jesus. I'm stretching, I'm straining, I'm pressing toward that goal, always heading closer to it. And then the fourth and final thing, of course, is keeping our eyes on the prize. We need to be looking to Jesus. If we're taking our eyes off and looking all around us at everybody and everything else, we're going to forget what we're supposed to be doing. We're going to be like the dog that, is supposed to be doing one thing and then a squirrel, and we get off distracted by that, like that dog does. We can't do that. We've got to keep our eyes on Christ. Colossians 3:1 through 4 says, "If you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above. Set your mind on the things above." Put your mind on the heavenly things, not on the physical things. Hebrews 3:1, he says, "Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, Christ Jesus." 1 Peter 2:21, he says, "For to this you were called, because Christ suffered for us, leaving an example that you should follow his steps." He's already gone on ahead. We need to be following him. We need to be going the same way he went. You ever try driving or running even walking sometimes, without looking at where you're going? Did that when I was a kid one time with my mom, and I'm walking along beside her, not paying any attention to her, ran smack into a pole, wound up having to get these two front teeth pulled out because I smashed right into that pole. Well, you don't watch where you're going, things like that happen. You don't watch where you're going when you're driving, you run into something. You run off the road. These things happen if you're not looking ahead. We need to keep our eyes on Christ. We need to keep looking ahead. He is the author, that's the beginner, the writer of it, and the finisher of our faith. He didn't just start it and then not complete it. He started it and completed it. He wrote it and he finished it. And his faith took him to the cross. And there was a joy ahead. And because of that, he endured the shame of the cross. He endured the pain of the cross. He endured everything about that cross. And he was rewarded. He's now sitting at the right hand of God. And he promises us, if we will follow, we can also receive a crown of life. We can receive our reward at the end of the race as well. We need to get rid of the weight of sin before the snare of death. Luke 21 and verses 33 through 36, Jesus tells the parable. He says, heaven and earth will pass away, my words will never pass away. But take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing and drunkenness and the cares of this life, and that day come on you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare to all those who dwell on the face of the earth. Watch, therefore, and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. How are you doing on your Christian race? Have you started? What are you waiting for? Get in the race so you can win the prize. Did you start the race and then you've kind of stepped off the path and gone off to other things and you need to get back on track and get back in the race? That's the good thing about it. I remember running track. There were always the lines on the track, and you started the race, and especially the shorter races. The longer ones you could move to the inside, but the shorter races you started in your lane, and you had to stay in your lane. And if you got out of your lane, you were disqualified. It didn't matter. You couldn't step out and then step back in. No, if you stepped out, it was over. You lost the race. You were disqualified. The good news about the Christian race is even if you have stepped out of your lane, even if you have gotten off the track, you can come back. Jesus allows you to be forgiven for that and get back on the track and run again, unlike those races that I ran as a kid. How are you doing? Are you getting weary? Are you wanting to give up? Take heed, or take courage. Be encouraged that you're nearing the end. I know you've been running a while, but the race isn't over yet, but the prize is up there. Keep your eyes on the prize. Are you remembering that you don't have to be the best, you don't have to be the fastest, you don't have to be the strongest. You just have to be faithful and persevere and finish that race. If you're here and you're not a Christian, become one today and enter that race. You are a Christian, but perhaps you need encouragement. Perhaps you need forgiveness for sin that you need to get out of your life that's weighing you down. Maybe there are other hindrances weighing you down. If you have a need to respond for prayer or for any other reason, please do so as we stand and as we sing.